5 minutes, 4 carriers. The entire war turned upside down. In just 6 months, Japan had conquered half of the Pacific. Every battle had proven their point. Americans were too soft, too divided, too weak for a real war. And then came Midway. It wasn't superior weapons that won. It wasn't greater numbers. The Japanese outmatched the Americans in almost everything. Victory belonged to the codebreaker in his bathrobe who cracked the uncrackable code, to the pilot who flew where logic said not to a nation that turned out to be nothing like its enemies believed. Japan made one fatal mistake. It believed its own propaganda. 5 minutes proved how wrong they were. This is the story of how underestimating your enemy became the most expensive lesson in history. June 4th, 1942, 0630 hours. Latitude 28 degrees north, longitude 177 degrees west. The deck of the USS Enterprise pitches beneath Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's boots as he grips the canopy rail of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Salt spray mists his goggles. The carrier's bow cuts through Pacific swells, leaving a wake of white foam that disappears into the vast, indifferent blue. McCluskey doesn't know it yet, but in exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes, he will change the course of human history. His gloved hand trembles, not from fear, but from the previous night's sleeplessness, from the weight of 33 aircraft under his command, from the knowledge that somewhere beyond the horizon lies the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 108 Zero fighters, 93 dive bombers, 71 torpedo planes, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Darwin, Ceylon, ships that had steamed unchallenged across half an ocean, leaving only burning wrecks and conquered territories in their wake. The Japanese called it Kido Butai, the mobile force. To American intelligence, it was simply the force that cannot be stopped. McCluskey touches the silver compass on his instrument panel. Beneath it, folded and already sweat-stained, lies a grid map with coordinates penciled in shaking handwriting. Intelligence coordinates. Codebreaker coordinates. The kind of coordinates that shouldn't exist, because the Japanese naval code, JN-25, was supposed to be unbreakable. But Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team in the basement of Pearl Harbor had done the impossible. They had cracked it. They knew the date. They knew the target. They knew down to the nautical mile where Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carriers would be. What they didn't know was whether anyone would believe them. The arrogance of victory. 7 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida had led the first wave over Pearl Harbor. From the cockpit of his Nakajima B-5N Kate, he had watched the American Pacific Fleet transform into a tableau of fire and twisted metal. Battleships capsized, oil burned on water, men jumped from decks into flames. Tora, 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 he had radioed. Tiger, tiger, tiger. Total surprise achieved. In the officers' mess of the Akagi that evening, sake flowed freely. Admiral Nagumo had raised his cup to toast the Emperor, and every man present understood the implicit message. America was soft. America was unprepared. America was divided. America would sue for peace within 6 months. The theory wasn't baseless. It emerged from decades of Japanese naval doctrine, from Mahanian concepts of decisive battle, from a careful study of American political divisions and isolationist sentiment. The Americans were materialistic, comfort-loving, individualistic. How could such a people sustain a war of sacrifice and suffering? After Pearl Harbor came the proof. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines fell. Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Burma, all fell. In 6 months, Japan conquered an area larger than Hitler's Europe. The rising sun flag flew from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific. In Tokyo, military planners spread maps across polished tables and discussed the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere as an accomplished fact. They drew defensive perimeters. They allocated resources. They debated whether to attack India or Australia next. None of them factored in the possibility that, at that very moment, in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, a balding, eccentric cryptanalyst named Joseph Rochefort was working 20-hour shifts, subsisting on coffee and sandwiches, slowly unraveling the threads of JN-25. Rochefort wore a smoking jacket and slippers to work. His colleagues thought him odd. His superiors in Washington thought him insubordinate. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, thought him brilliant. By late May 1942, Rochefort's team had intercepted and partially decoded enough Japanese communications to piece together an alarming picture. A massive operation was planned. The target was designated AF. The date, early June. But what was AF? Rochefort suspected Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, home to a small airfield and fewer than 3,000 personnel. To verify, he devised a brilliant deception. He had Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese intelligence intercepted and relayed, AF is short of water. The trap was set. The weight of uncertainty, June 4th, 0702 hours. McCluskey's Dauntless roars off the Enterprise's flight deck, part of a strike force that represents nearly everything American naval aviation can muster in the Central Pacific. 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. It's not nearly enough. The mathematics are brutal. The Japanese have more planes, more carriers, more experience, better aircraft in almost every category. The Zero fighter can outclimb, outturn, and outrun anything the Americans have. The Kate torpedo bomber has already proven devastatingly effective. Even the Val dive bomber, Japan's equivalent to the Dauntless, has combat veterans in every cockpit. McCluskey knows this. Every pilot in his formation knows this. They've seen the intelligence reports. They've heard the stories from survivors of earlier battles. They understand that statistically most of them will not return. The Dauntless climbs to 19,000 feet. The formation holds tight, diamonds of 3, sections of 6, the classic dive bomber pattern. Below, the Pacific stretches endless and empty. No ships, no wakes, no sign of the Japanese fleet that should be exactly where Rochefort said it would be. 0920 hours. Fuel gauges drop toward the halfway mark, the point of no return. McCluskey checks his coordinates again. Nothing. The ocean mocks him with its vast indifference. Did Rochefort get it wrong? Were the Japanese codes a trap within a trap? Is the real target somewhere else entirely? He has a decision to make. Every minute of flight burns fuel he'll need to get back. The book says, turn around. Logic says, turn around. 33 pilots, depending on his judgment, say turn around. McCluskey turns southwest instead. Later, military historians will call it intuition. Others will call it luck. McCluskey himself, in his after-action report filed 3 days later, will write simply, I proceeded to search in the most probable direction. The truth is messier. It's a guess based on enemy doctrine, on Pacific currents, on the direction a Japanese commander might take if he just launched a strike at Midway. It's a gamble that will either save the battle or doom 33 crews to run out of fuel over open ocean. 0955 hours. A white line appears on the horizon. Wake, ship wake. Not one ship, dozens. A screen of destroyers, heavy cruisers. And there in the center, the unmistakable silhouettes of aircraft carriers. 4 of them. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, exactly where they should not be, but exactly where Rochefort said they would be. McCluskey's gloved hand doesn't tremble anymore. 5 minutes that changed everything. 10,000 feet below McCluskey's formation, the Japanese carriers are in chaos. 20 minutes earlier, Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet had attacked. 15 TBD Devastators, flying low and slow, their torpedoes primed, their pilots committed to a death run they knew they couldn't survive. The Zeros had torn them apart. All 15 Devastators shot down. 29 of 30 men killed, not a single torpedo hit. Then came Torpedo Squadrons 6 and 3 from Enterprise in Yorktown, same result. The ocean below Nagumo's carriers was now littered with burning aircraft and floating debris. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 would survive. The American torpedo attack was an unmitigated disaster, but it had accomplished something the dead pilots would never know. It had dragged every Japanese Zero down to wavetop level. On the Akagi's flight deck, Commander Fuchida, wounded from the morning's operations, watches the frantic rearming operation. The carriers had launched strikes against Midway at dawn. Now those planes are back, needing refueling and rearming. But the reconnaissance reports American carriers in the area, so Admiral Nagumo has ordered switch from land attack bombs to armor-piercing bombs. No, wait, switch back. No, belay that. Torpedoes for ship attack. The result? Chaos. The flight decks are crowded with aircraft. Fuel hoses snake everywhere. Ordnance crews have stacked the removed bombs and torpedoes wherever they can find space, against bulkheads, next to aircraft, in passageways. Every regulation about ammunition handling is being violated in the rush to prepare for what everyone knows is coming, the decisive carrier battle. What no one is watching is the sky directly above them. 10:02 hours. McCluskey rolls his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive. The world tilts. The ocean rushes up. The Kaga fills his bomb sight, 800 feet long, displacing 42,000 tons, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On her deck, McCluskey can see the red circles on the wings of parked aircraft. He can see men running. He can see the white foam of her wake. 32 more Dauntlesses follow him down. The laws of physics that govern a dive bomber attack are merciless and precise. From 19,000 feet, a 1,000-pound bomb falls for approximately 40 seconds before impact. During those 40 seconds, a carrier traveling at 30 knots covers approximately 800 feet. This means the bomber must release not where the target is, but where it will be. It requires mathematical precision, ice-cold nerves, and the ability to ignore the fact that every second spent in the dive is a second for anti-aircraft gunners to track you, aim at you, and kill you. McCluskey releases at 2,000 feet. The bomb falls away. The Dauntless shudders as 500 pounds of weight disappears from its belly. McCluskey hauls back on the stick, pulling 7 Gs, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, blood draining from his brain. The ocean surface blurs past, close enough to touch. Behind him, 32 more bombs fall, 10:03 hours. The first bomb strikes the Kaga near her island superstructure. It penetrates the flight deck, detonates in the upper hangar. The second bomb hits forward. The third hits amidships. Each 1,000-pound warhead releases energy equivalent to 1 ton of TNT in a space packed with aviation fuel, armed bombs, armed torpedoes, and ammunition. The Kaga doesn't sink immediately. She burns. Simultaneously, and this is the part that Japanese officers will later describe as impossible, as beyond the realm of probability, as evidence of divine intervention against them, Dauntlesses from the Yorktown are diving on the Soryu. 3 direct hits. The Soryu's magazines detonate. Her entire forward section lifts into the air, then collapses. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stands on the bridge wing, watching his flagship's flight deck erupt in flames. A single bomb has struck near the elevator amidships. 1 bomb. But that 1 bomb has ignited the fuel lines, which have ignited the rearming ammunition, which has ignited the stacked ordnance, which has created a chain reaction of explosions that no human effort can stop. Fire crews rush forward. Within seconds, they're dead, incinerated by secondary explosions. The captain orders the magazines flooded. Too late. The fire has already reached them. Torpedoes begin detonating in their storage racks, each explosion tearing another hole in the Akagi's hull, each hole admitting more water, each ton of water pulling the carrier lower. 10:07 hours, 5 minutes of combat. 3 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, transformed from the most powerful striking force in naval history into blazing wrecks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survives only because she was separated from the main formation during the rearmament confusion. Commander Fuchida, wounded and burned, is carried from the Akagi's bridge to a destroyer. As he's lowered on a rope, he looks back at the ship from which he had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Flames shoot 300 feet into the air. Explosions tear through her hull every few seconds. Men jump from her decks into oil-slicked water. It occurs to him that this is what Pearl Harbor must have looked like. The price of truth. 18 hours later, Ensign Wesley Frank Osmus of Scouting Squadron 8 regains consciousness. He doesn't know where he is at first. The last thing he remembers is his Dauntless taking anti-aircraft fire during the attack, the engine coughing, the ocean rushing up. He'd managed to ditch, he thinks. He remembers water, darkness, then nothing. Now he's on a ship. A Japanese ship. Hands pull him upright. An officer appears, young, his uniform crisp despite the smoke and chaos visible through the portholes. The officer speaks English with a British accent, probably educated in London before the war. "You're on the destroyer Arashi," the officer says. "You have been rescued from the ocean. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Osmus's mind struggles to process this. Rescued? Treated according to the Geneva Convention. He expects interrogation, torture, execution. That's what the propaganda films had shown. That's what veterans of the Philippines campaign had reported. The Japanese don't take prisoners. Everyone knows that. But a medic appears. He examines Osmus's injuries, a gash on his forehead, badly bruised ribs, possible concussion. The medic works carefully, professionally. He applies bandages. He offers water. He does all of this while outside, the Arashi's guns fire at distant aircraft, while smoke from burning carriers darkens the horizon, while the crew around them speaks in urgent, frightened voices about the catastrophe unfolding. Over the next hours, as the Arashi steams away from the battle, Osmus pieces together what has happened. The 4 carriers, all burning or sunk. The pride of the combined fleet destroyed in a single morning. The invincible Kido Butai scattered and fleeing. The Japanese sailors avoid his eyes. This bewilders him more than anything else. According to everything he'd been taught, they should be celebrating their racial superiority, mocking American weakness, preparing him for brutal interrogation. Instead, they seem shocked, diminished, as if reality has betrayed them in some fundamental way. One evening, Osmus has lost track of exactly how many days have passed. A young Japanese sailor approaches his cage in the ship's brig. The sailor is perhaps 19, with a bandage wrapped around his left hand. He stares at Osmus for a long moment, then speaks in halting English. "You, American. We were told you are weak, soft. You love machines, but not," he struggles for the word, "not sacrifice, not duty. We were told you would surrender after Pearl Harbor, after Philippines, after Singapore." The sailor pauses, his eyes searching Osmus's face. Why you not surrender? Osmus doesn't have an answer, or rather, he has too many answers, none of which would translate. How do you explain democracy to someone raised under military dictatorship? How do you describe American individualism to someone trained in collective sacrifice? How do you convey that the very things Japan saw as weaknesses, the debates, the dissent, the apparent disunity, were actually sources of resilience? "Because it's our ocean too," Osmus finally says. The sailor nods slowly, as if this answer, inadequate as it is, makes more sense than anything his officers had told him. The Arashi reaches Japan 3 weeks later. Osmus is transferred to a prison camp near Yokohama, where he will spend the next 3 years. But something happens during that transfer that will haunt him for the rest of his life. His wounds, which the Arashi's medic had treated, have become infected. In the confusion of transfer, no one notices until he collapses during a forced march to the camp. He's running a fever of 104 degrees. Sepsis has set in. Without immediate treatment, he will die within days. He's taken to a Japanese military hospital. What happens next contradicts everything both sides had been taught about the other. A Japanese military surgeon, Dr. Takashi Yoshida, who had studied at Johns Hopkins before the war, examines him. Yoshida doesn't see an enemy. He doesn't see propaganda. He sees a young man, 23 years old, dying of a treatable infection. Yoshida operates immediately. No forms to fill out, no waiting lists, no propaganda broadcasts about treating American prisoners with the contempt they deserve. The doctor simply does his job with the same care he would give any patient, while around him Japan mobilizes for total war, while propaganda ministers craft narratives of racial supremacy, while military planners devise new strategies to compensate for the catastrophe at Midway. Osmus wakes from anesthesia in a clean hospital bed. The wound has been debrided and sutured. The infection is being treated with sulfa drugs, precious resources in wartime Japan. A nurse checks his vital signs with the same routine efficiency she would use for any patient. Later, when Osmus tries to understand this moment, tries to reconcile it with what he knows of Japanese military brutality, he will realize that Dr. Yoshida's choice represented something both governments would deny, that beneath the propaganda and the hatred and the manufactured racial narratives, some humans simply refuse to let other humans die when they have the power to save them. It doesn't change the war. It doesn't prevent the atrocities that will follow. It doesn't save the thousands who will die in Japanese prison camps or the hundreds of thousands who will die in the strategic bombing campaigns. But for one young American pilot, it proves that the propaganda, all of it from both sides, was fundamentally incomplete. The enemy was human, which meant they could bleed, which meant they could lose, but it also meant they could show mercy, which meant the entire framework through which both nations viewed each other was, at best, a partial truth designed to make killing easier. Stories like these matter. They remind us that history isn't just about grand strategies and political decisions, but about individual human beings making impossible choices in extraordinary circumstances. If these narratives resonate with you, if you believe in preserving and sharing these forgotten moments of humanity amid war, consider leaving a super thanks to help support this work. Your contribution, however small, helps keep these stories alive for future generations. The Silence of Numbers. By June 6, 1942, the Battle of Midway is over. The final accounting is stark. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, 3,057 men killed. America lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, 307 men killed. But these numbers tell only the surface story. The deeper truth takes months to emerge, understood first in Tokyo, then gradually acknowledged even by the most optimistic military planners. Japan's carrier fleet is not merely damaged, it is fundamentally crippled. Building a fleet carrier takes 3 to 4 years. Training a carrier pilot takes 2 years. More critically, the experienced pilots lost at Midway, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the aces who had perfected their craft over China and the Pacific, cannot be replaced at all. In contrast, America's industrial base is just beginning to mobilize. In 1942, American shipyards will launch 7 escort carriers. In 1943, that number will jump to 28. By 1944, it will be 34. The Essex-class fleet carriers, larger, faster, more capable than anything afloat, will begin joining the fleet at a rate of nearly 1 per month. The soft, materialistic, comfort-loving Americans are about to demonstrate an industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. More aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined. More destroyers than all other navies' total tonnage. More submarines, more cruisers, more battleships. Entire fleets built from scratch while simultaneously fighting a 2-ocean war. But the real devastation is psychological. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff meets in emergency session. The official report on Midway is classified at the highest level. Casualties are minimized in public announcements. The sinking of 4 carriers is mentioned almost in passing, buried beneath triumphant claims about damage inflicted on the American fleet. But those in command know the truth. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, retreats to his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato. For 3 days, he speaks to no one. When he finally emerges, those who know him well notice he has aged years in mere days. His confident swagger is gone. Yamamoto had warned before Pearl Harbor, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months. But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The prophecy had fulfilled itself with mathematical precision. The architecture of intelligence. While carriers burned and admirals despaired, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort sat in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, reading intercepts and allowing himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The operation that had culminated in the Battle of Midway was, at its core, an intelligence victory. Not luck, not happenstance, not even primarily the heroism of pilots, though that was essential. It was the triumph of mathematics, linguistics, pattern recognition, and the unglamorous work of hundreds of codebreakers who never saw combat. The JN-25 Naval Code was a polyalphabetic cipher of extraordinary complexity. Each message used a different encryption key, selected from tens of thousands of possible keys. Without the proper key, any given message was indistinguishable from random noise. But Rochefort's team had found the weakness. The Japanese Navy, like all military organizations, was a creature of habit. Certain phrases appeared with predictable frequency. Weather reports followed standardized formats. Ship position reports used consistent terminology. By analyzing the frequency and distribution of encrypted groups across hundreds of messages, by comparing known plain text with encrypted versions, by exploiting operator errors and repeated message headers, the codebreakers had gradually built a partial dictionary of code groups. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where 90% of the pieces were missing, and the remaining pieces might not even belong to the same puzzle. Yet from those fragments they had extracted enough information to predict the exact time and location of Japan's largest naval operation. Admiral Nimitz had trusted them. That trust represented its own kind of courage. Nimitz had staked the Pacific Fleet, everything America had left after Pearl Harbor, on the word of a balding eccentric in a smoking jacket who claimed he could read the enemy's mind. If Rochefort had been wrong, if the Japanese had attacked from a different direction or at a different time, the American carriers would have been caught out of position, vulnerable, potentially destroyed. The war in the Pacific might have been lost in a single afternoon. But Rochefort had been right. That rightness would later earn him a demotion. Navy brass in Washington, jealous of a mere lieutenant commander who had proven more valuable than entire battle fleets, would see to that. Rochefort would finish the war in obscurity, his contributions classified, his name unknown, except to a small circle of colleagues who understood what he had accomplished. But in June 1942, sitting in that basement with its bare concrete walls and banks of filing cabinets filled with intercepts, Rochefort understood something that few others had grasped. The nature of modern war had fundamentally changed. Information was now a weapon as powerful as any battleship. The ability to read enemy communications, to understand their intentions before they acted, to position forces based on intelligence rather than guesswork, this would decide the war in the Pacific more surely than any number of ships or planes. America's advantage wasn't just industrial. It was mathematical. It was the ability to solve problems that others considered unsolvable. It was the willingness to trust eccentrics and misfits who didn't fit military molds. It was the flexibility to integrate intelligence into operational planning in ways rigid hierarchies couldn't match. Japan had assumed American decadence. They had mistaken comfort for weakness, diversity for division, democratic debate for paralysis. They had built their strategy around the belief that one decisive blow would shatter American resolve. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous, a democracy at war with all its chaotic energy channeled toward a single purpose. Ripples in time. 50 years later, in 1992, retired Admiral Raymond Spruance speaks at the Naval War College. He is 85 years old now, his hands steady, but his voice carrying the weight of decades. Spruance had commanded the carrier task force at Midway, making the tactical decisions that transformed Rochefort's intelligence into battlefield victory. People ask me, Spruance says to the assembled officers, what was the key to victory at Midway? They expect me to talk about carrier tactics, or dive bomber accuracy, or Japanese mistakes. But the real answer is simpler and more profound. He pauses, his eyes distant. perhaps seeing again that June morning 50 years past. We knew where they would be. Because of that knowledge, everything else became possible. Without it, we would have been searching blind, burning fuel, probably missing them entirely. Intelligence transformed a desperate defensive action into an ambush. It gave us the one thing you can never recover in war: time to prepare. In the audience sits a young lieutenant commander named Michael Mullen, who will one day become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's taking notes, trying to extract lessons applicable to a world where aircraft carriers share the stage with submarines, cruise missiles, and the early hints of cyber warfare. What Mullen doesn't yet realize, what few in that room fully grasp, is that Midway represents a template that will repeat throughout the 20th century and beyond. Intelligence as a force multiplier. Information warfare as decisive as kinetic warfare. The ability to know your enemy's plans before he executes them as valuable as any weapon system. The codebreakers in Rochefort's basement were the spiritual ancestors of every signals intelligence operation, every cryptanalytic breakthrough, every satellite reconnaissance program that would follow. They proved that in modern war, the side that sees first usually wins. But there's another lesson, darker and more troubling. Somewhere in that same 1992 conference sits a Japanese naval officer, part of an exchange program. He listens to Spruance's speech with professional courtesy, but his mind is on something else. His grandfather had served on the destroyer Isokaze at Midway, had survived the battle, had spent 3 years in American captivity. The grandfather never spoke much about the war, but in his final days, delirious with fever, he had muttered about the unbreakable codes that were broken, about the invincible fleet that proved vincible, about the Americans who were supposed to be soft, but fought with a ferocity that matched anything Japan could muster. We didn't understand them, the grandfather had whispered. We thought we did, but we didn't. We saw what we wanted to see. That's the real lesson of Midway, the one that transcends naval tactics and intelligence operations. It's about the danger of believing your own propaganda, about the fatal tendency to mistake different for inferior, unfamiliar for weak, about the human capacity for self-deception when it serves our purposes. Japan had looked at America and seen a reflection of their own fears and prejudices. They had constructed an elaborate narrative about American weakness, then gathered evidence that supported that narrative while dismissing everything that contradicted it. They had confused isolationist sentiment with cowardice, love of peace with inability to wage war, democratic debate with paralysis. The reality was more complex. America in 1941 was deeply divided about intervention. But once attacked, that division transformed into a unity of purpose that Japanese military planners simply couldn't comprehend. The same democratic messiness they had scorned became an engine of innovation, as civilian engineers, scientists, workers, and soldiers brought diverse perspectives to solving military problems. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. She was statistical reality. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Factories that had produced automobiles retooled to produce tanks. Universities that had focused on pure research shifted to weapons development. The entire economic and social structure bent toward victory with a flexibility that totalitarian systems, for all their apparent efficiency, couldn't match. The memory of water, June 4th, 2022. 80 years to the day after the battle. The USS Carl Vinson, a Nimitz-class supercarrier, passes through the waters where the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu went down. On the flight deck, a memorial service is held. 300 sailors stand at attention. The ship's chaplain reads the names of the American dead. Then, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable in 1942, he reads the names of the Japanese dead as well. 3,057 names. The reading takes 42 minutes. Among the attendees is Captain Robert Ballard's grandson, a young naval officer who has just finished reading his grandfather's account of discovering the Yorktown's wreck in 1998. The carrier lies 3 miles down, remarkably preserved, her aircraft elevator still visible, shell holes from Japanese bombs still evident in her flight deck. Also present is the great-granddaughter of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived Midway. She's a professor of international relations at Tokyo University, specializing in conflict resolution. Her research focuses on how nations misread each other's intentions, how propaganda distorts perception, how wars begin because people on both sides believe what they want to believe rather than what is true. After the ceremony, she stands at the rail looking down at the water. Somewhere below, 3 miles down in absolute darkness, lie the remains of the Akagi. Her great-grandfather had commanded the air group on that ship. He had believed in Japan's destiny, in the righteousness of their cause, in the fundamental weakness of their enemies. He had been wrong about almost everything, but in the years after the war, Fuchida had done something remarkable. Instead of clinging to the old narratives, he had questioned them. He had asked, why did we believe what we believed? Where did our intelligence fail? How did we so fundamentally misunderstand our enemy? His answers had been uncomfortable. Japan's military leadership had selected intelligence that confirmed their biases and rejected intelligence that contradicted them. They had surrounded themselves with yes men who reinforced their worldview. They had mistaken military success for proof of their theories rather than understanding that early victories often come from surprise and preparation, not from any fundamental superiority. Most damningly, they had underestimated their enemy's capacity to learn, adapt, and innovate. The Americans who lost at Pearl Harbor were not the same Americans who won at Midway. 6 months had transformed a peacetime Navy into a hardened fighting force. Another 3 years would transform it into the most powerful naval force in human history. Standing on the Carl Vinson's deck, watching the Pacific sun set over water that holds so much history, Fuchida's great-granddaughter thinks about the lessons that each generation must relearn. Don't believe your own propaganda. Don't mistake different for inferior. Don't assume the future will resemble the past. And perhaps most importantly, in war, the side that learns faster usually wins. The Echo Wesley Frank Osmus was released from Japanese captivity in September 1945. He returned to the United States weighing 98 pounds, his body marked by 3 years of inadequate rations and hard labor. But he was alive, which was more than could be said for most of his squadron. He never spoke publicly about Dr. Yoshida, the surgeon who had saved his life. The incident didn't fit the narrative either side wanted to tell. Americans preferred stories of Japanese brutality, which justified the firebombings and atomic weapons. Japanese preferred stories of American barbarism, which justified their own actions. A story about a Japanese military surgeon treating an enemy prisoner with the same care he would give his own countrymen complicated the moral clarity both sides needed. But Osmus kept a photograph. He didn't know where it came from. One of the prisoners had somehow obtained a camera, had taken pictures in secret despite the extreme danger. The photograph showed the hospital ward where Osmus had recovered. In the background, barely visible, a figure in a white coat makes rounds. Dr. Yoshida. Osmus kept that photograph in his desk drawer for 50 years. He never showed it to anyone. But on June 4th of each year, the anniversary of Midway, he would take it out and look at it, remembering the young Japanese sailor who had asked why Americans didn't surrender, remembering the surgeon who had saved his life while his country burned around him, remembering that even in the midst of total war, some humans refused to hate. When Osmus died in 1998, the photograph was found among his effects. His children debated what to do with it. Finally, they donated it to the National WW2 Museum in New Orleans, where it sits now in the Pacific Theater collection. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. It's not dramatic. It doesn't show combat or heroism or any of the things people associate with war stories. Just a blurry photograph of a hospital ward, a figure in white making rounds. But occasionally someone stops, studies it, reads the small placard that explains its provenance. And in that moment, perhaps, the lesson of Midway comes full circle. The battle proved that underestimating your enemy is fatal, that intelligence wins wars as surely as weapons, that the capacity to adapt, learn, and innovate matters more than initial advantages, that democratic systems, for all their apparent chaos, can mobilize resources and energy that rigid hierarchies cannot match. But it also proved something quieter, something that official histories rarely emphasize, that even in the midst of propaganda and hatred, individual humans can choose to see each other as humans. That mercy exists even in war. That the enemy's humanity is not erased by the fact of their enmity. This is perhaps the most dangerous lesson of all because it complicates everything. It makes war harder to wage, harder to justify, harder to sustain. It suggests that the narratives both sides tell themselves, the stories of absolute good versus absolute evil, are always incomplete, always propaganda, always designed to make killing easier. Japan thought America was weak. They were catastrophically wrong, but America thought all Japanese were fanatical militarists incapable of mercy. That was wrong too. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Coda, the dauntless Wade McCluskey's SBD Dauntless, made it back to the Enterprise with 7 gallons of fuel remaining. 7 gallons, enough for perhaps 3 more minutes of flight. As he climbed out of the cockpit, his knees buckled. Adrenaline crash. Exhaustion. The weight of what he had just witnessed. Deck crews rushed to catch him, but he waved them off. He needed to stand on his own, needed to prove to himself that what had just happened was real. Around him other Dauntlesses were landing, or trying to. Some, out of fuel, were ditching next to the carrier. Destroyers raced to pick up the crews. The air operations officer was already calculating losses, preparing the grim statistics for Admiral Spruance's report. But McCluskey was thinking about something else, about the moment he had turned southwest instead of northeast, about the white wake on the horizon, about the 5 minutes that had changed everything. Later, historians would call it the most consequential 5 minutes in naval history. They would analyze it from every angle, write thousands of pages about the tactics and timing and luck. They would argue about whether it was intelligence that won the battle, or American dive bombers, or Japanese mistakes, or some combination of all three. But standing on that carrier deck, fuel-stained and exhausted, McCluskey understood something simpler and more profound. They had won because they refused to believe the enemy's assessment of them. Japan had looked at America and seen weakness. They had seen isolationism and assumed cowardice. They had seen democratic debate and assumed paralysis. They had seen love of peace and assumed inability to wage war. They had been wrong about every assumption. The Americans who fought at Midway proved something that every generation must relearn. That judging an opponent by your own prejudices rather than their actual capabilities is the surest path to defeat. That propaganda, even your own propaganda, is a poor substitute for intelligence. That in war, as in life, reality has a way of asserting itself regardless of what we choose to believe. McCluskey would survive the war. He would retire as a rear admiral, write his memoirs, live to see the 50th anniversary of the battle he had helped win. But he never forgot that moment of decision when he turned southwest based on nothing but intuition and hope, when he gambled 33 lives and possibly the outcome of the Pacific War on a guess about enemy intentions. He made the right choice. History records that. But he also knew in his quieter moments that he had been lucky. If the Japanese carriers had been 50 miles further north, if Nagumo had zagged instead of zigged, if the timing had been off by 10 minutes, the story would have ended very differently. War is like that. It rewards the prepared and the intelligent and the brave, but it also rewards the lucky. Midway was all of those things: preparation by codebreakers, intelligence by Rochefort, bravery by pilots, and yes, luck. The kind of luck that comes when you force the enemy into positions where their mistakes matter more than their strengths. The Japanese thought America was weak. They learned otherwise, and in that learning, in that terrible education written in burning carriers and drowned pilots and shattered assumptions, lies a lesson that echoes across the decades. Never, ever believe your own propaganda.